this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats. Today it is snowing out heavily. It is the first snow of the winter where I am, but that also means that it's really dark outside, so my lighting is terrible. And I'm going to get cold here sitting by the window without the heating unit on because it makes noise. But anyhow, I am here today to do not one, but two different tags, both TBR related. About 4 months ago, Maya from Maya Reads kindly tagged me in the TBR tag. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to do this tag, this is wonderful, but it's also super intimidating because I'm going to have to explain how my TBR works. Not just like, oh my gosh, all of these books on my TBR, but like actually how I organize it, which started out as an orderly system and is no longer orderly. But it is still a system. I am not a mood reader. I do not pick things off my TBR at random. I read what comes to the top of the pile based on how the system works. But the system itself is increasingly like this steampunk Rube Goldberg machine that acquired consciousness somewhere along the way and just started running off without me. And then the second tag I am going to do is the intimidating TBR tag, which I was tagged in just yesterday by Roya from Unicorn Hunter Books. And even though it's not directly demanded by the questions of the intimidating TBR tag, my answers to those questions are going to make more sense if I've managed to answer the questions from the TBR tag first. So that's what I'm going to do, and this is going to be a big video full of TBR taggishness. So first I'm going to do the TBR tag, which was created by a blog called A Perfection Called Books. I will link the original post down below. There are 12 questions in this tag, and the first is how do you keep track of your TBR pile? So this is the biggie. In theory, I use a flawless hybrid of a physical TBR and a Goodreads TBR. My Goodreads TBR, I have always been upfront about the fact that it is not comprehensive because I cap the number of books on that TBR. Currently, I keep that cap at 100. I do that because as a Goodreads user, I specifically, for no particularly good reason, just for my own sanity, I would like my books on Goodreads to be overwhelmingly books that I have already read. That way, if anyone, like say any of you, goes poking around in my books, you will be seeing mostly things that I already have opinions and ratings on, and less things that I've just marked to read willy-nilly. So right now I have 271 books on my read shelf. My to read, as I said, is capped at 100. I may increase that to 110 when I reach, say, 300 books on my read shelf. It's really kind of up to me. And for the most part, with some exceptions that I don't particularly want to get into right now, my Goodreads TBR, the books on it, are organized approximately, at least, in the order that I intend to read them. My goal with the Goodreads TBR is to read things off the top of the list and add things at the end of the list. The same is essentially the case for my physical TBR, which has way more books on it than my Goodreads TBR, even though my Goodreads TBR includes books that I intend to get from the library and therefore don't have on my physical TBR. So there is no one comprehensive TBR. The Goodreads TBR has books I want to get from the library on it, and books I don't yet own but may pick up for cheap if I find a cheap used copy of them before they come to the top of the list and I get them from the library. The physical TBR has lots of books that I have already purchased and hauled but have not yet made space for on that Goodreads TBR. I essentially sort of have a system where when I add things to the bottom of that TBR, I sort of alternate, like a book I own, a book I don't own, a book I own, a book I don't own. I've now started to incorporate some Kindle books into there, so it's like a book I own, a book I don't own, a book I own on Kindle, but it's going to be a long time before those books make it to the top and I actually read them. But right now, though, I have a major problem with that main TBR queue. My physical TBR starts here with books that I intend to read in the next month or two. It then jumps over there, 2 nightstands, both of them contain books, again kept in the order in which I want to read them, a row of books on the bottom shelf of this one right here, and then there are like 4 stacks of books on the ground by the door. You're not going to get to see any of this because I'm not going to give you that satisfaction. When I purchase a book that was already on my library list on my Goodreads TBR, I insert it into that queue at the point where it was in that queue regardless. But lately, I have a major problem with this main TBR queue that I have so carefully organized, even though it doesn't look organized when you look at the room. It is. I know what's in what order. It isn't moving at all. I am not reading books off of it. And that's because I've built in so many different ways that I allow books to bypass the queue. So here are just a few of my assorted fast pass systems. When I first started participating in readathons, I allowed that readathons would be a way that a book could jump to the front of the line. And I made a stack of readathon books that are right here, and these are mostly very short books that I thought would be great readathon books and therefore deserved to have their own special little queue and not have to wait in the long line. These are mostly novellas, middle grade books, and a few childhood rereads, books I liked as a kid and want to try reading again to see if I still like them. So yeah, like lots of the Tor.com novellas in there, the Chronicles of Prydain are in there, that sort of thing. Then of course there are read-alongs in addition to things that spontaneously happen within the booktube community. I'm a member of at least one Goodreads group that I regularly participate in read-alongs with that group. There's a whole bunch of new releases, things I've pre-ordered that I'm not going to relegate to the queue, because right now that queue has gotten to be like a couple years worth of reading long, and I'm not going to wait that long to review some of these books. There are impulse library books, which I'm actually reading less and less of because I'm focusing on books I own right now, but even when I'm reading more library books, I never let myself read more than one library book for every owned book that I read. I have this whole extra category here of books that I have been given as gifts that I want to read in a timely enough manner to tell the people that gave them to me what I thought of them. There are books that I want to prioritize because of their popularity, because people have specifically recommended them to me, because I'm so pumped to read more by a certain author and I don't want to make that book wait in the line. And I try to slot these in near the top of that main queue sparingly, but if I keep doing that sparingly, eventually all of the books towards the top of the queue are sort of these books, without any of the ones that have actually waited their turn mixed in. And then finally, last but not least, there are review books, because I have started requesting review books from NetGalley this year, and I'm actually really loving reading more new releases and getting to review them around the publication date. That's something I'm genuinely enjoying right now. I'm sure I still have not explained all of the eccentricities of how I organize my TBR, but you basically get the picture of how confusing it is. But at the end of the day, I have never been displeased really with the books that it offers me to read on the tops of my piles. Somehow out of all of this madness comes a system where I am reading books that I want to be reading. And I never have really much of a problem figuring out what to read next. So if it's not broken, don't fix it, right? Right? So that was essentially question 1, how do you keep track of your TBR pile? So I used to also have a TBR list with my library catalog. I no longer do that because my library switched over to a different catalog system and it doesn't work so well for that. Number 2 is your TBR, mostly print or ebook. Absolutely print. I didn't have a Kindle until last year. And I have said before, I really have no idea still how I am going to end up long-term incorporating Kindle books into my TBR as a whole. I'm sort of acquiring a lot of like super cheap Kindle deals and some freebies, and those are all books that I want to read, but they tend to be much lower priority for me than any of the books that I physically own. So I'm sort of like hoarding them for a rainy day, and I don't know what sort of rainy day that is. I do think I want to do a sort of what's on my Kindle video pretty soon, so that's a discussion for another day. Question number 3, how do you determine which book from your TBR to read next? I sort of read what's on the top of the pile. That is the short answer. The long answer is, I don't know, but it works. It works, except the main queue is not moving somehow. The books over there have like not physically moved on the shelves for a really long time. So this is where I might reach a breaking point soon and have to totally restructure my TBR system. Anyhow, that was the first 3 questions of the tag, and it's sort of one big sloppy mess. If you can figure out how my TBR works from what I've told you, good for you. The rest of the questions are all going to be actual books, so this is going to be fun. Number 4, a book that's been on your TBR the longest. This is one that actually isn't on my Goodreads TBR at all, but it's a book that is near the top of my physical TBR. I should in theory be reading this sometime soon, except that physical TBR isn't really moving. But this is the book that I have owned the longest without reading it, because I bought this like back when I was in college, and I think it is the only book that I bought that long ago that I still have unread, and this is called Reindeer Moon by Elizabeth Marshall Thomas. I bought this because it was on a reading list recommended by one of my high school science teachers, and it was the only fiction book on the list. This is supposed to be like sort of like Clan of the Cave Bear for people who want their prehistoric fiction to actually be scientifically accurate. Elizabeth Marshall Thomas is an anthropologist. This is her area of expertise, and she knows her stuff. I haven't read Clan of the Cave Bear, that whole series. I don't really plan to, but I did start reading this several years ago. I got a few chapters in and I put it aside for a reason that I don't think would bother me anymore. Towards the very beginning of this book, the narrative splits into like a before and after narrative, where you're getting the life of our young protagonist, and you are also in alternating chapters getting her after her death in the afterlife that these people believe in. So you know from the very beginning of the book that the protagonist dies young and unliked by her people. And I just wasn't there for that when I picked this up several years ago. But since then I've actually gotten way more interested in getting back into this to read it more specifically for that interesting take on the afterlife. When I think back on those first few chapters that I read now, it's that I'm actually more interested in than the main story. Question 5 is a book that you recently added to your TBR, so this is going to be a book from my most recent book haul that I was not planning to read until I ended up with a copy. So this is The Hazel Wood by Melissa Albert. This is an ARC that I won in a Goodreads giveaway. It's going to be a January 2018 release, so out next month, and it is a YA contemporary fantasy debut with fairy tale-ish stuff in it. I'm really interested to see how this goes for me. I often wait to see what reviews are for new YA books before I dive into them if I don't already know the author. But I won this ARC, so I'm gonna read and review it. 6, a book that's on your TBR strictly because of its beautiful cover. So the closest thing I've ever done to a cover buy was buying this mass market paperback of Elfland by Frida Warrington. I wouldn't have bought it if I didn't think it was going to be a book that I was going to want to read, but the reason that I was interested in it in the first place was because that it has this is the first in a trilogy that have cover art by Kanuko Y. Craft, who does art for a bunch of the Patricia McKillop books, and I just think that her cover art is great, and it tends to advertise a type of fantasy that I really want to read. Right now this is buried in the queue that doth not move. The mass market paperback is like over 600 pages though, so I might be able to justify bumping it up for some round of tome topple or something. Question number 7, a book on your TBR that you never plan on reading. This seems so counterintuitive because I plan on reading all of these books, that's why I have them. But I thought, okay, I can go around the room and I can look at all my books, I can find something that I don't want to read, and then I can unhaul it. Except I couldn't. I still want to read all of these books. But I do have a couple authors where if the next book I read by them isn't my cup of tea, I'll say I've given them enough chances and ditch the rest of the books I own by these authors. The first, oh, this pains me to say this, this is these Robin Page Victorian mysteries that I've been reading on and off with my mom for years, and it's been like a bonding thing between me and my mom. The first few had like a charming romance arc between the main characters, and I feel like as the series has gone on, it's just sort of given up on having actual storylines for the characters. And I've been feeling less and less like reading these sort of cookie-cutter mass-produced mysteries these days. Even though it was something that I really enjoyed at a time in my life, I do want to get back into reading mysteries, but I feel like my growing dissatisfaction with this series has been turning me away from the genre as a whole. And you know, these were gifts from a family member, and my mom and I were enjoying them together, and I'm gonna give the series one more shot, but if it doesn't hit like at least a 3 stars for me, I'm just going to give the rest of them to my mom to read without me. And then the other author I'm feeling this way about right now is also sort of mystery-ish, and also one of my mom's favorites, so I'm feeling terrible, and that is Kate Morton. I haven't read this book, The House at Riverton, but I have 2 of her books on my TBR, and one that I'm currently reading that I'm going to be talking about in the second tag, so I'm not really going to discuss how I'm feeling about Kate Morton right now. That's going to be later. 8, an unpublished book on your TBR that you are excited for. I very rarely, but I do sometimes, add unpublished books to my Goodreads TBR. A bunch of them that I had on there have just been released already in the last few months. There is one more that I added a while back that is not yet released, and that is Binti the Night Masquerade by Nnedi Okorafor. I absolutely know that I'm going to read this because I loved the second book in this series. Number 9, a book on your TBR that basically everyone's read except you. For me, this is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This has been like right on the top of this list for so long, and it keeps not getting read because I keep picking up other things that I need to review, or I'm reading for a readathon or some themed reading month or something, and it's just infuriating that I can't actually like burn through all those things fast enough to actually pick this book up. Question 10 is a book on your TBR that everyone recommends to you. I don't think there's one book that everyone recommends to me, but there are a couple books that specific people recommend to me over and over again, are like, why haven't you read this? This is obviously your type of book. I'm like, I own it, but shall I explain to you how it's in the TBR queue that does not move? And if I keep pulling things from that TBR queue to go to the top of the list, I am only making the problem worse. One of these is Deathless by Catherine M. Valenti, one of the most well-known books by one of my favorite authors, and I haven't read it. The other one is Arcadia by Ian Pearce, which is supposed to be super smart with various different narratives, some of them speculative. Like if I were going to do a 5-star TBR predictions video, which I would kind of really like to do, these would both be on it, but that would mean that I would have to actually pull them to the top of my TBR, which is increasingly cluttered with things that are jumping in line for all sorts of reasons. So I would really like to do a 5-star TBR predictions, and I would really like to use that as an excuse to pull some of these books that I think I'm going to love to the top of this TBR, but I'm not going to let myself do it until I clear out a bunch of the clutter of, like, the 2017 releases and the other high priority things and the read-along books and etc., etc. So this is a motivation for me to get through some of that stuff so that I can start moving things to the top of the TBR for more personally satisfying reasons. Number 11, a book on your TBR that you are dying to read. This is another one that would also totally be on the 5-star TBR predictions video that I'm not doing, and that is Fairy Tales for Wild Girls by Alison Neer. I ordered this like a year ago from Book Depository because this is only published in Australia. This is like a middle grade or YA dark fairy tale fantasy book. It has like nothing but rave reviews online. It has a gorgeous cover. I was drooling over it on the internet for like a year before I decided to finally cave and buy it from Australia, and it's just been sitting around since then on the stationary TBR line of doom. And then the final question is number 12, how many books are on your TBR shelf? So I have stated earlier in this video that neither my physical TBR nor my Goodreads TBR is exhaustive. My Goodreads TBR, as I've said, is capped at 100, includes books that I don't own physical copies of. On my physical TBR, I counted 187 books. This includes books that are on my to reread list that I shelve with my TBR books instead of with my read books. But I only counted rereads that are not yet on my Goodreads read shelf, meaning I read them before I joined Goodreads. Many of them are childhood books. The 187 number includes those rereads. It excludes books I currently have out from the library. It excludes Kindle books, and it excludes books on that Goodreads/library TBR list of doom. So now I'm on to the intimidating TBR tag. The origins of this tag seem to have been lost in the foggy histories of the internet because I found videos that linked to the original creator's video, but that account seems to no longer be active, and that video is no longer accessible, and it's pretty much impossible for me to tell who actually created this tag and when. But as I said, I was tagged by Roya from Unicorn Hunter Books. But the first question in this tag is, what book have you been unable to finish? And for me, that is The Secret Keeper by Kate Morton. This is like my mom's favorite book. This is her copy that she loaned me like a couple years ago. I was reading this, I started reading it a few months ago, and like 2 months ago I put it down and haven't picked it up since, except I read like a chapter last night. I feel like I cannot DNF this book because it is like my mom's favorite ever, because the main selling point of this book, as far as I've heard, is that there's a massive twist at the end, and I'm going to need to know what the twist is so I can tell my mom that I got there. This is the second Kate Morton book that I've read. I read The Lake House, well, I listened to it on audio, and it went really, really slowly for me, and I thought it was just the audio format that generally audiobooks go slowly for me. But this has been even worse for me in print. Part of it is that I particularly despise one of the main point of view characters in this book, and I have from like the very first that we met her. There are only two major point of view characters, the one that I despise and the other who is kind of a bland, absolute nothing of a character. This is kind of like a schmaltzy family murder book about long-kept secrets, and I'm really only reading SFF right now, and I just kind of don't care. 2, what book have you yet to read because you just don't have the time? Have I mentioned all of the books? But I've chosen to interpret this question as, you know, a book that I actually thought I would have read by now. It was on my November TBR. I didn't get to a lot of books on my November TBR. I'm basically letting it carry over to being my December TBR. So I did think that by now I would have read The Boy Who Lost Fairyland by Catherine M. Valenti. This is gonna happen this month, I hope. Cross my fingers. November and December are always slow reading months for me. I think I'm going to be traveling for Christmas with just my Kindle and no physical books. I don't know what I'm gonna end up getting read this month. 3. What book have you yet to read because it is a sequel? Because it is a sequel is not the reason that I have not yet read any of the books that I own on my TBR that are sequels. The reason that I have not read them is obviously the queue that moveth not. I do have a sort of arbitrary rule that I put at least 3 books in the physical TBR between every book by the same author, including books in a series, and then other things keep getting slotted in and they get further and further apart. So I have 2 books that are sitting patiently in that queue that I thought I would have read this year. At the end of last year, if you'd asked me how far I was going to get in that TBR queue in 2017, I would have definitely said that there was no way I was not going to plow through both of those books. It has not basically moved all year, is what I'm trying to tell you with this entire video. This has been a year where everything I've read has been like jumping ahead of things in line. Which means that there are 2 series that I started in 2016 that I fully intended to read the rest of the series in like 2017, but because those books were patiently waiting in line like good little books, they just didn't get read, and now it's been more than a year since I've read the first books in each of these series. The first is The Tropic of Serpents by Marie Brennan, the second in the Memoirs of Lady Trent series, and the second is A Hero for Wandla by Toni Ditterlitzy, which is the second book in the Wandla trilogy, which is beautifully illustrated, fun, action-packed middle-grade sci-fi. Neither of these are intimidating books for me to read at all. They are both going to be super light and fun. This series is Fantasy of Manners, which is one of my like reading happy places, and this is Fun Middle Grade, which is another one of my reading happy places. This series, I gave the first book of these to my young cousin last year for Christmas. He has read it and apparently liked it, so I'm giving him the rest of the trilogy for Christmas this year, but I have not yet read the rest of the trilogy, so yikes. Question 4, what book have you yet to read because it is brand new? And for this I'm highlighting one of the books from my last haul video, and that is The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night by Jane Campbell. This is one of the books I'm definitely going to be plowing through in January when I am planning a very exciting reading month of like all of the 2017 releases I have blocked up, clogging the system, that I'm just so pumped for all of them, this one included. Question number 5 is, what book have you yet to read because you read a book by the same author and didn't enjoy it? As with all questions on this list, that is not the reason that I haven't read this book yet. The reason I haven't read this book yet is because it is in line. But a book that does fit the bill for a book that I have on my TBR that I want to read, that I did read a book by the same author and didn't like, is going to be Knight's Master by Tanith Lee. Now, I read one of Tanith Lee's YA books when I was a kid. I remember nothing about it except that I didn't like it. And so as an adult, I have taken a really long time to come around to the notion that I really do want to read Tanith Lee's adult books. This is one I'm really excited to read. It is the first in a series called Tales from the Flat Earth that is the sort of stories connected to stories, stories within stories format that's based on the 1001 Nights that I tend to really be a sucker for. The sort of storytelling where hopefully something super epic will come out of all of these smaller stories. This is a series that I really want to read because that's a very specific type of storytelling that I really like in fantasy. Number 6, a book that you have yet to read because you are not in the mood for it. For me, this is a book that I have on loan from my dad, and that is why I have it and why I am going to read it, and it is Erewhon by Samuel Butler. My dad told me that I should read this because it is like the origins of the dystopian genre. This was published in 1872. My dad said he had to read it like in college or something. The history of dystopia is something that my dad is very interested in. But I'm not sure that the old dead white dude history of dystopia is something that I particularly care about. 7. What book have you yet to read because it is humongous? So there actually aren't a ton of humongous books on my TBR, like physically humongous. Long books I tend to buy in mass market paperback form, so going through my TBR, I didn't actually find like big chunker like bricks a lot. The thing that I have that actually is humongous, and the reason I haven't read it yet has to do with the physical humongousness and not because, for once, that it's languishing in the TBR queue, is this bind-up of Jules Verne books. This is called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Other Classic Novels. It has like 5 Jules Verne novels in it. Basically, I bought this like over a year ago because I had read several books that I really liked that were supposedly inspired by Jules Verne and some of their world building. I thought I should read some actual Jules Verne so that I can identify these elements in books that I like. And I sort of thought that at some point I would start slipping one of these in a month. I never put it in the physical queue though because it is massive, it's a bind up, and I'm only planning on reading one book at a time. So I sort of just shoved it at the back of the shelf here and forgot about it. Oops, so I still intend to slip these into my reading at some point. I have no idea when. Doing this tag has reminded me that I have this, and I should read it. 8. What book have you not yet read because it was a cover buy that turned out to have terrible reviews? Now, I look up the reviews of every book before I buy it. Even if it is just like a $1 bargain used impulse purchase, I will pull out my phone and bring up Goodreads. So I know if a book has bad reviews before I buy it, and if I choose to buy it anyways, it's because I still want to read it despite those bad reviews. This is a book though that does happen to have a gorgeous cover, though that's not why I bought it. It does happen to have some strongly mixed reviews, though that's not why I haven't read it yet. I have seen some negative reviews from people that I follow and trust come out since I bought the book, but it doesn't change my opinion on how I think I'm going to feel about it, and that is Wildwood by Colin Malloy, with illustrations by Carson Ellis. Basically, when I'm in the mood for like quirky, twee, middle grade fantasy, I will take whatever quirky, twee, middle grade fantasy I can get. And even if those books are books that aren't thought of as the best of the best, even if those are books that have some mixed reviews, I tend to still enjoy them just because it's a type of book that is escapist and comforting for me. But this is languishing with all of the others in the TBR backlog. Number 9, what is the most intimidating book on your TBR? And I thought about all of the ways that books can be intimidating for me. They can be intimidating because they're supposed to be intellectually challenging. So something like Arcadia is intimidating for me for that reason, but I still think that I'm going to love it, so I'm not like intimidated by it. Something can be intimidating because of physical size. I don't actually have any of those right now. Something can be intimidating, and some of the books that are on my library TBR are intimidating because they're out of my comfort zone, because someone recommended them to me, so I'm gonna give them a shot. But I'm not sure that they're really going to be my cup of tea. But I wanted to pretty much only show you guys books that I own in this video. So the most intimidating book that I own on my TBR right now is intimidating not for any of those reasons, but because of the subject matter. And that is Farthing by Jo Walton. This is the first in a series of books that are, from what I gather, structured sort of like cozy British mysteries, but set in one of these terrifying alt histories with more Nazis. And what I gather is that while the plot is structured around this mystery, the real point of the book is about the terrifying alt history with more Nazis. And I bought this book before we were living in a terrifying alt history with more Nazis. And since then, this has just become increasingly intimidating for me, for obvious reasons. Now, fortunately for me, this is actually trapped quite a ways down on that TBR that moveth not. So I am sitting here crossing my fingers that by the time this winds its way to the top of my reading stack, we will no longer be living in a terrifying alt history with more Nazis. Please allow me this optimism just for once. So the theme of this double tag video has definitely been that I have this problem where my main TBR system has ground to a halt in the year of 2017. And in 2018, I'm going to need to decide if I'm going to fix that system and change it, or if I'm going to decide that this is actually okay. I might spend a while in 2018 just plowing through all of the books that I really want to read, and then seeing if I get back to the main stack of things at some later date. Anyhow, question 10 is, who do you want to tag? I had the glorious idea that maybe I could reverse tag the 2 people who tagged me in each of these tags, but Maya has already done both tags. I think I can tag Roya in the other tag, in the regular TBR tag. She tagged me in the intimidating TBR tag. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but in case you haven't done it, I am tagging you. And then there are a couple of people I'd like to tag to do either or both, because I don't think either of them have done either of these tags, and those 2 people are Charles of Sir Booksage and Leah Cooper. So that's who I'm tagging. Of course, you do not have to be tagged to do a tag. If you want to do either of these tags or both of these tags as one video, and let me know, I would be happy to watch your videos. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.